Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel Code with GoldenCat. Today we'll create a simple Twitter web application project using Spring Boot framework. Hello. By the end of this video, you should have a web application that looks something like this with a working login and registration page. So if I register a user here, user, and give it a password of 123, then click on register. Now if I go back to my login page and log in with those credentials, as you can see, we don't have any daily posts yet. So I can add some posts here. Hello world, then post it. And here I can see my daily posts. Now if I log out and log back in using a different user, say user2, and give it a password of 123 again, register it, then log back in user2 123. And you can see I can see the post from other users as well. And I can also add my own posts. Hello kitty cat. Now without wasting any more time, let's dive straight into coding. Now first, we need to clone this repository simple Twitter. The link for this repository is given in the video's description. We'll go here code and then copy this URL. Then go to our working directory and then write cmd here, which would open command prompt, and then type in git clone and the repository URL. Once the repository has been cloned, you can open that up in the intellij. Now here in the git tab, you can see right now we are at start branch. Now the start branch here contains the skeleton project. If you want the finished project, you can get that by checking out this end branch. But check it out and go to src. You can see it has all the files that we'll be creating in this video. Now let's move back to start. Now let's close this and see what we are getting back in our skeleton project. In the src main folder, we have this Twitter app application, which acts as the starting point for the project. Then in the resources, we have a background image for our project. And then we have a couple of templates here. The add template is used to add posts in our project. Then we have the home template that is being used as a home page. Then we have login template and the registration template. Other than that, in the application.properties, we have defined a couple of properties for configuring the H2 database. Now in the pom.xml, most of the dependencies we have already covered in our previous videos, so you can go and check them out. The only new dependency that we are using here is this Spring Boot Starter Security. Now this dependency is used for Spring Security to secure the application. So most of the logic that we'll be writing for login and logout and registration pages comes from this dependency. Now that we understand what we are getting back in our startup project, let's dive straight into coding. First, we have to create a couple of folders here. So we'll be creating controller, then model, then config, then repository, and finally a service folder. First, let's start by creating the models. We'll go here and create a class called user. Click on add here. Now in this class, we'll be defining three properties. First, private long ID, which would act as the primary key for this table. We'll type in @ID here and @generated value strategy generation type dot auto. Other than that, we'll also be creating some more properties here. Private string username and private string password. Now to make this model an entity and creates its table in the H2 database, we'll type in @entity here as an annotation from Spring Boot and @table. And we'll name this table as name equal to users. We're not using the name user for our table because that is defined as a keyword. So we'll be creating the name as users. Once this done, we'll create the getters and setters for this. So we can go here and then click on getter setter. Now, if you're not sure what these annotations mean, then I suggest you take a look at the previous video that we have created for our expense tracker application, in which we have defined these annotations in detail. Once this done, we'll create yet another model here and name it as post. Now again, we'll add an annotation here @entity and @id to define the primary key, generated value, then strategy equal to generation type dot identity. We'll give it three properties: private long ID, which is our primary key, then private string content, and private local date time. Also, we'll need to define a many-to-one relationship between a post and a user. So a user can have multiple posts. So we can define that using @many to one annotation here. And for joining a column, we'll type in join column name equal to and then user underscore ID, private user and user. Now a post will have a single user, but a user can have multiple posts. So that is why we have defined a many to one relationship here, and we are joining this user with user underscore ID column. So if you see here, this will be joined using this. Now let's go back here and create the getters and setter for this. Click on OK. And we are done with our entity part. Now let's define user repository interface and post repository interface. So we'll go here and then click on Java class, then type in user repository and use interface. Now this interface would extend the JPA repository with the values user, long, and we'll define two methods here: user find by username and it would take our input as string username, and another method user save user DTO. After this, we'll also create a post repository. We can go here and then type in post repository, then select interface here, and then type in extends JP repository post, long. Now that we are done with the repository, let's create some services. So the first service that we'll be creating would be post service. Now this post service would be a service, so we'll add service annotation here to mark it as a service. Then it would have a field private final type post repository, and then a constructor, public post service, which would take in post repository object as a parameter. Now we are using dependency injection here. If you're not sure what it is, we have already covered that in our previous video, so go check it out. Other than that, we'll also create two methods here, public void save. Now this method would be used to save the post, so it would take in a parameter as post. Now let's import this class and we'll type in post.set created at then local date time dot now. Once this done, we'll call the post repository dot save method and then pass in post here. Other than this, we'll also need to create one final method here, public list post find all. Now this method would be used to return back the list of all posts that is shown at the home page. I will also need to import this list. After that, we'll simply type in return post service dot find all. Now that we are done with the post service, let's jump to the user service. So we'll define the user service as an interface here. Now the reason why I have defined the user service as an interface is to show you a different type of architecture where we first create an interface and then creates its implementation. We don't directly use the implementation. And this architecture is used widely in production. But to save our time, I don't really use interfaces in my projects. But you are free to do so. Now after this, we'll create two methods in this interface. User find by username, string username, and user save, which would take in an argument as user DTO. Now we'll import these classes. Now for this interface, we'll create an implementation here. We'll create a class here, name user service simple, which is implementation. Now this would implement the user service interface, and we can define the methods by implementing the methods here and then click on OK. Now to declare this as a service, we'll again use the annotation @service and we'll define property here of type password encoder. @autowired for dependency injection. Now we are using this password encoder to encode our password when we are storing that in the H2 database. Other than this, we'll also need to define a user repository field here, private user repository, and then a constructor Now after this, we'll define the find by username method. We'll change this null to user repository dot find by username, then username, and the save We'll remove this part, then type in user equal to new user, which would have the values user dto dot get username, comma, user dto dot get password. After this, we'll return it user repository dot save and then save it. Now this giving us an error here. Let's see that. Expected 0 arguments but found 2. Okay. We also need to pass this as a password encoded form. So we can type in password encoder encode and then wrap around this password. Other than that, we'll also need to define the constructor in the user model. Let's go back here and define a constructor here. Public user, and this would take in 2 arguments, string username, comma, string password, and then we can set them like this. Now we are not getting the error back. Now that we are done with the services, we'll need to create some config files here. We can go here and create the first config file with the name custom user details. Now this class would implement an interface here, implements user details, and it would have 3 properties: private string username, comma, private string password, and then private collection question mark extends granted authority. Now this field authorities is a private field to store a collection of authorities, that is roles or permissions granted to a user. Now for this application, we'll only be using the user roles, but if you want, you can also define user and admin roles and then separate them. Now a user role would have restricted access to the application, whereas the admin would have a full access and privileges of the application. Now that it's done, we'll need to implement a few methods here. So we can go here and click on implement methods, and then we'll select all of them, click on OK, and we are not seeing the error anymore. Now we need to make some changes in these overrided methods. So for this first get authorities method, we'll be returning back authorities. Then for this get password, we'll return back password. And then here we'll return back the username. Now for this method is account non-expired, we'll return back true. Now this method returns a boolean indicating whether the user's account is expired or not. Other than that, for is account non-logged, we'll also return back true here. Now this method returns a boolean indicating whether the user's account is logged or not. After this, we'll also make changes here as true. And for this, we'll also change it to true. Now that it's done, we can move on with creating another config file here with the name custom user details service. Now to mark this class as a service, we'll use @service annotation here. And then this would implement an interface user detail service. Now we are getting an error here. So we need to implement some methods here. Now click on OK. Now for this service, we'll define data field here, private user repository, user repository, and then define public custom user detail service. Then define user repository here. Now for this overridden method, we'll change the return from null to user user equal to user repository dot find by username, then username. Now we'll need to import this user class here. We can type in user again. Now with this method, we are retrieving the user stored in the H2 database. Now if the user is null, that is, the user doesn't exist, then we throw an exception here, username not found exception, with the message username or password not found. But if you do find the user, then we'll return new custom user details and then user dot get username comma user dot get password comma authorities. Now we'll need to define this authorities method. So we'll type in public collection then question mark extends granted authorities, and then return arrays dot as list. Then type in new simple granted authority of type user. Now we are again getting back an error here because we have not defined a constructor with 3 parameters. We'll go back to custom user details and then define a constructor here, public custom user detail, which would take in username, password, and collection authorities. Then we can map them and we are not getting back the error anymore. Now you might be thinking that we have already created a user class here in the model, then why we are creating the custom user details? And you're right, we don't really need another class here with the same properties. The only difference between those classes is authorities. You can also define that in the model here as a separate data field. But to make it easy to understand for the login and logout procedures that we'll be creating now, I have kept these classes as separate entities. Now that we are done with this, we'll create another config here with the name security config. Now this is the configuration file that would be handling the logic behind our login and registration pages. So first, we need to add two annotations here at the rate configuration and at the rate enable web security. Now at the rate configuration indicates that this class is a configuration class, and at the rate enable web security enables web security in the application. After this, we'll do a field injection here. The keyword again, autowired. custom user detail service, and then define a method here, public static password encoder, which would return new bcrypt password encoder and will mark it as a bean. Now we are marking it as a bean so that this method returns a bean to be managed by the Spring container. And we are defining the password encoder method for encoding our passwords. Now this password encoder method returns an instance of a bcrypt password encoder which is used for hashing passwords. Once that is done, we'll create another bean here and create a method public security filter chain which would take in HTTP security the input and it throws exception. Then we'll define HTTP dot tsrf and we'll disable this for now. Now line number 27 disables CSRF protection. This is typically done when working with non-browser client or testing. After this, we'll define some authorized HTTP request. We'll type in authorize HTTP request, then type in auths dot dot request matcher slash register dot permit all. Now with line number 29, we are allowing unrestricted access to the slash register URL. So if a user visits your application, then he should have an unrestricted access to the slash register page. That is, he shouldn't be asked to log in before visiting the registration page as it doesn't make any sense. After this, we'll also define a couple of more permit all URLs. We'll also define slash home, then h2 console, then images, and finally dot any request dot authenticated. Now with line number 33, we are requiring authentication for any other request not explicitly permitted. Now once that is done, we'll configure our form login. We'll type in dot form login, then form here dot login page slash login dot login processing URL slash login again, and then default success URL, that is forward slash comma true, then permit all. Now line number 36 specifies the login page URL. Line number 37 specifies the URL that will process the login form submission. Then line number 38 specifies the default URL to redirect to after successful login. And then line number 39 allows unrestricted access to the login page and login processing URL. Now that we are done with this, we'll also need to configure logout. So we'll type in dot logout dot invalid HTTP session true dot clear authentication, that is also true, dot logout request matcher new and path request matcher slash logout, then logout success URL, which would be slash login logout, then finally permit all. Now with line number 43, we are invalidating the HTTP session when the user logs out. Then line number 44, we are clearing out the user's authentication information. Then with line number 45, we are specifying the URL that triggers the logout action. Then with line number 46, we are redirecting to the login page with a logout message after successful logout. And finally, with line number 47, we are again allowing unrestricted access to the logout functionality. Now after this, we'll configure headers by typing in headers dot frame option. Now with line number 50, we are allowing the use of iframes within the same origin that is useful for accessing the H2 console. After this, we can return http.build, which would finalize the configuration and return the build security filter chain object. After this, we'll also need to define another method here, public void configure global authentication manager builder auth. And we'll type in auth dot user detail service custom user detail service dot password encoder, then password encoder, and we'll mark this as at the rate autowired. Now with autowired, it injects the necessary dependency into the method. And with line number 59, we are configuring Spring Security to use the custom user detail service for loading user details and the password encoder for password hashing. Now finally, we can work on the controllers now. So first controller that we'll be creating would be user controller. To mark this as a controller, we'll type in at that controller here, and this would have an auto-wire dependency, that is private user details service and private user service. Then we'll create a constructor here, public user controller, would take in user service for dependency injection. This dot user service equals to user service. Now the first endpoint that we'll be creating would be slash login. So we'll type in get mapping slash login, and then public string login model model comma user user TTO. Now let's import these. Now after this, we'll type in model dot add attribute user comma user DTO return login. Now this method would return the login page to the user. After this, we'll define another get mapping, but this time it would be for registration page, and we'll return back register. After this, we'll create an endpoint with post mapping that is used for registering or saving the user in the H2 database. We'll type in slash register and then public string register save at the rate model attribute user. After this, we'll type in user equals to user service dot find by username user DTO dot get username. If the user is not equal to null, that is the user exists, then we'll type in model dot add attribute user exist comma user, then return register. But if it doesn't exist, then we can type in user service dot save user DTO and then return redirect slash register question mark success. That's it. We are done with the user controller. Now we'll create the post controller. We'll go here and then create post controller. Now we'll mark this as a controller first at the rate controller. After this, we'll type in private final post service private final user service, and let's import this post service as well. We can copy this, then type in dot post service. After this, we'll create a constructor here, public post controller Now that we are ready, we can create a first endpoint for the post controller. We'll type in get mapping forward slash public string home. Now this endpoint would return back the home page. So we'll create a list of posts and get back the data from our H2 database using find all method, and then add that data in the model. Let's resolve these errors first. Import this class and import the post class. And then inside this, we'll type in slash posts and return back home. Now we'll need to create another get endpoint here for returning back the add post page. Name this as show add post form. Let's remove this part and change this to new empty post, and it would return back add. Now finally, we'll need to create a post endpoint here that would be responsible for adding and saving the post made by the user. We'll type in at the post mapping slash add public string add post at the rate model attribute post post authentication auth equals to security context holder dot get context dot get authentication. And let's resolve this authentication error by importing org.springframework.security dot core dot authentication. Now line number 43 would return back the information regarding the user's credential that is currently logged in. Now once we have those, we can type in custom user details user equal to, let's import this, and then we'll explicitly cast it to custom user details auth dot get principal, and then using that we'll find the user details from the DB user service dot find by username user dot get username, and then post dot set user existing user post service dot save post, and finally a redirect to the home page. Now that we are done with this, let's start our project by typing in mvn spring boot run and then open Google Chrome and type in localhost 8080 and we are getting back our login page. Now I can also traverse to the registration page here and we are getting back the registration page as well. Now let's open the H2 console as well to see what is happening at the backend side. Localhost 8080 slash H2 console. The password is password. Right now we have two tables here, host and users, and both of those tables are empty right now. So as you can see, there is no record here. But if I create a registration here with the name GoldenCat and password 1234, then click on register. As you can see here, we are getting back the row with username GoldenCat that we just created. Now I can also create another user here, say KitKat, and give it the same password 1234. Then click on register and same thing happens again. But now if I try to create a user that already exists in the H2 database, say GoldenCat and then password something else, and then click on register, I'm getting back the error username is taken. Now let's go back to our login page and log in with GoldenCat credentials. Right now we don't have any posts here. So let's add some posts. Hello world. And let's add another post. I like cats. Now as you can see that I'm seeing the posts that were created by me. Now suppose if I log out now and then log back in with different users, say KitKat. Now as you can see that even with the KitKat username, I'm able to see the post made by GoldenCat because that's what we intended with this application. Now I can also add posts here using this user, say hello from KitKat cat, then post it and we can see it here. So this is the basic fundamental idea behind Twitter that we have just implemented. Now, if you want, you can expand this application by adding likes, subscriptions, and pub-sub models to this application. As always, we'll end this video with a quote that says, "Whatever can happen at any time can happen today." Thank you for watching and have a great day.